Welcome to the next video of Pylint. I'm here on the official Pylint documentation site and I want to outline some more information about the usage of Pylint. At first we can go to the user guide part, which is the important part for us Pylint users, and we can go to running Pylint. So the important part is, as we saw in the last video, we can lint one Python file if we just type in Pylint and the Python file. We can also run Pylint on a whole package. So if I go back one level in our terminal, so I'm currently in chapter 2 coding guidelines, I can run Pylint on the pep8 folder. And if I scroll up a bit, at the start of our Pylint call, we can see in which file Pylint found some, for example, here errors or warnings and recommendations, etc. Okay, then we can go a bit further to the command line options. We can run these command line options in the terminal. So I call Pylint --help. And here we have the output about the configuration of Pylint itself. I can scroll up a bit and we see, for example, we can set the setting that we only want to check for errors. So Pylint would ignore the warning checks, the recommendation checks, and the coding guidelines checks, and would only run or only check for the error cases. Okay, so if I go a bit down, here is the text about the RC file, specifying all the options suitable for your setup and coding standards can be tedious. So it is possible to use a configuration file to specify the default values. You can specify a configuration file on the command line using the --rc file option. Otherwise, Pylint searches for a configuration file in the following order and uses the first one it finds. Pylint rc in the current working directory, .pylint rc in the current working directory, and so on. So the steps 3 to 8 I will skip for the moment. We will create a .pylint rc file now. And we can generate it with the command --generate rc file. We go back to the terminal. I call Pylint --generate rc file. And here we would get the content of the rc file in the terminal. So we have to create based on this output file. And we can do it if we type in the command from before. And then I enter the greater sign and .pylint rc. So now this output that we had in the terminal will be stored in the .pylint rc file. And this file should now be placed in the pep8 directory if you run the command inside the pep8 directory. So the file will be generated inside the directory you are currently in the terminal. So I'm in the chapter 2 coding guidelines /pep8 directory, so the file will be generated there. And if we go into the .pylint rc file, I see all the default options that are currently set for Pylint, which is a lot. It's about 600 lines in the file, and it is a lot that we can modify. So I will now show you the most important parts. So I will scroll down a bit to the point message control, and here we can disable certain warnings. So we can disable, for example, some user-defined warnings if we list them below the default warnings that are disabled. And I can enter a comment here like user-defined, that everyone knows here starts the user-defined warning deactivations. So I could add here this trailing white space. Trailing white space warning. If I go back to our test.pylint.py file from the last video, I can add some white spaces here, which Pylint will complain about. So I call Pylint test.pylint.py, and let me check. We get some other warnings. So if I remove this trailing white space here again, I can run test Pylint again, and we see we get the trailing white space warning. So if we list here some more warnings, so we can either list the code of the warning or the name of the warning. So we can either list trailing dash white space or CO303. This should work also. Then the warning will disappear, or better to say, Pylint won't check for this. So this warning disappeared. But I would recommend to not use these error codes, but instead the error name, because it is much easier understandable what warnings we will disable here. So no one knows exactly, or no one will remember that the error code CO303 will stand for trailing white space. So I recommend you to use the error name itself. Okay, so when we list these here, Pylint won't check these. And now we see that Pylint does some more warnings. And this is why I set up a setup.config file here for our project for this Udemy course. And there I disabled some more warnings. But now the .pylintrc file lies in the same directory as the Python file that we check. And as it is stated here, there's a certain rule which config file is used for the current Pylint execution. And at first, Pylint will search in the same directory, so in the working directory, which is just the same directory where our Python file is, for a .pylintrc or a pylintrc file. And if this file exists in the current working directory, this file, so this setup file, will be used for Pylint. If this file does not exist, Pylint will check for a pyproject.toml file and for a setup.config file. And exactly this file here in step 4, I added in our base directory of the Udemy course itself. So this config file was used previously, but since I now created this .pylintrc file as in the same directory as the Python file we check, this pylintrc file is now used. So we get some more warnings here. For example, missing module docstring. So Pylint complains about that we haven't added a docstring for the Python file itself. Also that we haven't added a docstring for the class itself and for some functions. If we do not want to have this warning here, we could list it here in the disabled part of the Pylint config. So I can list the missing module docstring, missing class docstring, and missing function docstring, for example. If we run Pylint again, these warnings will disappear, and we have just one warning type left, invalid name. And this is due to Pylint checks the variable names also. And as I said in the PEP 8 video, you should not name variables with a single letter. In our case, for this vector class, it is, in my opinion, okay, since we have the attributes x and y for our class, which indicates the x and y coordinates of these 2D vectors. So I would argue this name is okay for our class. And now we could disable the warning, and then we would have a score 10 out of 10 again. If you do not want to disable, for example, invalid name overall in the Pylint config file, you can disable it only in one Python file, for example. So we could enter here a comment, #Pylint column disable equals invalid name. I can run it again, and Pylint will skip this warning only for this file. So you can add comments in certain Python files to disable these warnings only in this file. The .pylintrc file is a config file for the whole pep8 directory we have here. Yeah. So if we want to disable for the whole working directory, for example, you can specify the disable warnings in the .pylintrc file. If you just want to disable a warning in a certain Python file, you can add a comment. Okay, if I go back to the documentation, you can read a bit more about different configuration options, etc. If you go back to the starting page, you can go to message control, and here you can see the different categories of the checks. So as we saw before, we have C for coding conventions, R for refactoring, W for warnings, E for errors, and F for fatal. And fatal means, Pylint couldn't run its checks on the Python file correctly. Also, as we can see here, we can disable warnings only in a function. So inside the function, you can add the same comment as we had in our file at the top. So hashtag Pylint :disable equals, and then we can list the warnings we want to disable. So you can disable it in a function. You can disable the warning for a certain line. Yeah, you do not have to disable the warning for the whole file. You can just choose a certain line. So you are pretty free in configuring Pylint and where you want to run Pylint. Okay, so one more thing to show. I'm here on the Pylint features part of the technical reference, and here are all features stated that are checked. So we have, for example, the check for good variable names, the check for property classes, argument naming style, const variables naming style, and so on. So we have a lot, as you can see, a lot of different checks that Pylint will check. And this is why Pylint will take a moment for big Python projects to check all files. So it can take several seconds up to several minutes to check all files, which is pretty slow compared to the other linters I will show after this video. But the major key part of Pylint is it checks the code itself. So for example, in the next video, I will show you Flake 8, and this tool is more or less only checking the coding style. So what would be in Pylint the C and R checks, and not the warning checks, for example. So different linters have different approaches of what they want to check and what they want to prove in your code. And Pylint is a feature or a linter that combines the coding style and the analysis of the code itself, if it's working or if there are any issues or warnings in your code. And this is Pylint in a nutshell. If you have any questions regarding the configuration of Pylint, you can ask me. And we will see us in the next video. Bye bye.